lead in protein powder sounds terrifying, but before you freak out, let's look at the data. Recently, an article by Consumer Reports claimed that protein powders from popular brands such as Momentous and Optimum Nutrition contain dangerously high levels of lead. So today I'm going to be investigating whether this is based on accurate science or if this is just another case of clickbait fear-mongering. We're going to be looking at lead toxicity, what all of the numbers actually mean, and how these numbers compare to real-life established safety standards. All of the resources that I'll be using are linked down in the description box below if you want to go and check out something for yourself. Enough rambling, let's get right into the video. I want to start off with lead toxicity just for you to know why this is so important to discuss in general. Lead is a heavy metal that is ubiquitous in our environment. It is present in our water, in the soil, in the air, basically everywhere. If you're living next to an industrial site, a more contaminated area, the chances are that the soil, the air, and the water in that area are going to contain somewhat more lead than if you lived somewhere else. Lead is therefore present in our food as well, because the crops can absorb some lead from the air and from the water and some from the soil. Therefore, a lot of the exposure that we have to lead actually comes from our food. Other more specific cases are if you have an occupational exposure and you work as a car mechanic, as a lead miner, obviously, also as a glass manufacturer, a plumber, a lot of different things that have to do with machinery and heavy metals in general. Lead has absolutely no physiological function in our body. It does not benefit us in any way. When we ingest lead, most of it, about 90%, is accumulated in our skeleton, so in our teeth and our bones. If we are chronically exposed to it over time, that could pose a threat to our health. For specific groups, this threat might be bigger than for others, such as children and also pregnant women. Their bones are in a state of demineralization, and for children specifically still in development, and some of the lead can also accumulate into the soft tissues, which is where it starts exerting its toxic effects. And for pregnant women, apart from the fact that lead would then start leaching from the bones as they go into this process of demineralization, lead can also, even in smaller amounts, have detrimental effects on the development of the fetus and can even lead to a miscarriage. Lead toxicity for children and for the fetus has become very popular, not for a good reason, because of the effect it has on the nervous system. Chronic exposure to lead for the fetus or for children has been linked to even a smaller size of the brain, a lower IQ, basically different types of cognitive impairments. Other negative effects on our health include the development of chronic kidney disease, the development of anemia due to some impairment of the immune function, and also a rise in the systolic blood pressure. So you can see how lead can exert its toxic functions in a lot of our organ systems. However, lead is present at the same time in all foods that we consume to some extent, also in our water to a very small extent. And if I have to compare food groups, cereals, leafy vegetables, those contain more lead than animal-based products such as eggs or meat. Other groups that are higher in lead are cocoa beans, so chocolate would be a little bit higher in lead. I think there was a similar scandal earlier this year. And seafood is also pretty high in heavy metals in general, since they accumulate a lot of things. I'm pretty sure you've heard something of the sort already. I'm going to get into how much lead is in your food exactly in a bit, but first we have to go through the protein powders. So now that we have lead toxicity out of the way, let's talk about the article from Consumer Reports. The scientists at Consumer Reports went and investigated multiple samples from 23 different protein powders and also protein containing products such as those milks that you can get that are supplemented, and then analyzed them for their contents of lead and also heavy metals such as cadmium, arsenic, etc. And as all of the viral headlines suggest, the highest issue became the contents of lead in these samples. The vegan protein powders were kind of the leaders in the classifications, since they contain the highest amounts of lead, on average 9 times more than the protein powders that were based on dairy, and about twice as much as the protein powders based on beef. And this might be due to a variety of reasons. Could be because of the fact that they are made from plants, and if these plants were sourced from an area where there is a higher exposure to lead, then that would mean that the plants themselves would also have more lead in them. At the same time, it could be due to the manufacturing process, the water that was used in the process, the machinery. The highest lead containing protein powder was this vegan mass gainer from Naked Nutrition, which contained the very scary 1,500 times more lead compared to what was the acceptable level of lead. Other protein powders from popular brands such as Momentous have actually been discontinued from the market. I did not understand if it was a result of the article or if it happened prior to the article being published, but they cannot be found on the market anymore. Before I go and criticize all of this, I want to mention that it is good that there is awareness raised for the fact that supplements usually do not undergo a lot of chemical analysis before they go out to the market, and it is not always 100% sure that you are getting what is written on the label, and they are technically being less controlled than pet food. So if this encourages manufacturers to test their products for different contaminants, this is a very good step in the right direction. And before I go into numbers, no lead is indeed better than some lead in all cases, but I think you already got the impression from me that lead is everywhere and you cannot limit your exposure to lead to 0. However, it is still useful knowledge for some people to know which powders contain less and which contain more lead. It also gives some insight as to which brands might have a bit of cleaner practices than others. Anyways, a lot of the numbers in this article raised a lot of questions for me personally, and I do not believe that the level that they set as acceptable is actually realistic, and most of the foods that you get from the grocery store would exceed that limit without even trying. The level that they had deemed as acceptable as a benchmark was this 0.5 micrograms of lead per day. And just to give you a comparison, the highest lead containing protein powder had 7.7 micrograms per serving. So you see where these 1,500% come from. These 0.5 micrograms of lead per day originate from the benchmark level set by the California Proposition 65 law. If you are not American like me, maybe you have no idea what that is. I did not know what that was, but after doing some research, figured that this is a law in the state of California that was established in the 1980s, and it requires manufacturers to put a warning label on their products if these products contain a chemical from their 900 plus chemicals list. The original purpose of this law was to raise awareness with the consumers as to what is actually in the products that they are buying, and to also kind of force manufacturers to clean up their practices so that they wouldn't have to put these warning labels on their products. However, these warning labels are not just for food products, they are basically for everything that you can imagine. They are being put on tools that you just might use that you're not going to eat and consume, obviously. They're being put on SSD cards and also at Disneyland. So you can see how some people might have stopped taking these warning labels seriously. The main issue with these warning labels is that they do not really take into account that much your exposure, your realistic exposure to the chemical in that product. It just warns you that the chemical is there. So this all has led sort of to warning fatigue, where nobody really takes these warnings serious anymore because they are present in basically everything. At the same time, I read that it can lead also to lawsuits for a lot of manufacturers if they cannot prove that they do not have this chemical but they do not have the warning label. To close off this topic, this is where this value came from. It is not an FDA-based value. It is not a European Food Safety Authority value. It is a value from the California Proposition 65 law.
I am re-recording this part because I found that I had some mistakes and inconsistencies in my calculations and also in my research. This value of 5.3 micrograms of average daily lead exposure per day for the average American was determined in research papers, studies that were done by the FDA in recent years. Unfortunately, I did not have any access to those papers since they are not open access and you have to purchase them, so I cannot give you any insight into how this value was exactly calculated. At the same time, you see this value down there of 8.8 micrograms of lead per day as an interim reference level. This is actually not for all adults, as this graph suggests. This is only for pregnant women, and there is the same value for children, an interim reference level of 2.2. There is no such value defined by any authority for the average adult. This interim reference level was designed specifically for these two groups because, as I explained in the first section of the video, they are more susceptible to absorbing more leads and having higher concentrations of lead into their bloodstream, and lead is known to have detrimental effects even in smaller amounts on the nervous system, especially when it comes down to children and also the fetus. These levels were defined through an analysis of multiple studies, the concentration at which detrimental effects to the nervous system were observed were, and then with this blood concentration, the possible intake that is needed to reach the blood concentration is calculated, and then there is another safety factor, and this is how you get to this number in the end. It is just designed with more caution in mind for these specific vulnerable groups. Another thing that the article failed to mention is that not all lead is indeed bioavailable. Not all lead is absorbed into our system, and not all of the lead that we ingest is going to lead to a raise in the blood concentration. And if you want to know how much lead does the average American have circulating in their bloodstream, I found this source with data from, I believe, 2017 and 2018, and it figured that for the average American, they had 0.9 micrograms per deciliter of lead in their blood, and these amounts are a lot lower than what has been observed previously, even 10 years prior to that. The study that I had on the whiteboard that I originally found had a bit of older data, and over there the blood lead concentrations were significantly higher. Even 10 years can make a huge difference, and the lead concentrations in everything worldwide are fortunately slowly starting to decline. Technically, these 0.9 micrograms per deciliter concentrations in the bloodstream would amount, if you calculate it directly, to around 22-23 micrograms of daily lead exposure for the average American. So this would not be the proposed 5.3, and here I might be making either a mistake in the calculations, or because I didn't have access to the papers by the FDA, I don't know if they applied any different type of factor.
So all of this raises the question, are we living in some kind of a lead toxicity epidemic right now? Is this posing a very dangerous threat to our health? I'm going to try to answer these questions with the results from the European Food Safety Authority scientific paper that came out in 2010. Here we have 0.36 up to 1.24 micrograms per kilogram body weight per day as the range for the average consumer. There was another group that was deemed high consumers, which can ingest somewhere between 0.73 up to 2 point something micrograms per kilogram body weight per day, and these people would be those that have a higher consumption of cereals, specifically leafy vegetables, all of these plant products that might have a bit higher levels of lead than animal-based products. For this number right here, the 48 micrograms of exposure per day, I took the mean of these two values and then multiplied that by 60 kilograms. This is kind of like an average weight for an adult, and then I got 48 micrograms of lead exposure. Scientists also gathered samples for different food groups over multiple years and then analyzed all of these samples so they can define average values of lead contamination in all of these foods. They included here cereals, potatoes, also meat, eggs, fish and seafood, milk, every food group that you can think of, and the higher lead containing groups such as cereals contained around 40 micrograms per kilogram of cereal. For potatoes it was 30 micrograms per kilogram, which is plenty of lead per kilogram, but technically the only food group that was below this 0.5 that was proposed by the California Prop 65 was water, and everything else exceeded that.
I want to add a couple of things here. First of all, the scientific opinion was published in 2010, which means that the exposure levels have likely declined, similarly to the data that I presented to you earlier for the US. And secondly, not all of the food samples that were analyzed in this paper actually contained lead in the first place. A lot of them were under the detection limit, and the results you see here are mostly from the samples that were indeed detected to contain some lead. Additionally, now in 2023 there was an update to the contaminants regulation in the European Union, and there were new limits set for all of the food groups regarding lead. However, the one for food supplements is quite high. It is around 3 milligrams per kilogram. However, I believe that this limit is indeed so high since most food supplements come in the form of a capsule or a tablet, and the case with protein powders require specific attention since they are being consumed in much larger quantities compared to other types of food supplements, and their case has to be addressed separately from the one for all of the other supplements.
I do understand that you're not going to be eating a kilogram of cereals or potatoes per day, but you can imagine that if all of these different plant products contain considerable amounts of lead, and meat, dairy and eggs, they contain less but they still contain some lead in them, when you combine all of this in a balanced diet with whole foods, which is a very healthy diet, then it will still add up to somewhere around this value even when you're on a healthy diet. And if you're consuming that much lead from your food, the amounts of lead that were found in the protein powders, I mean not the highest amounts, but I mean in the lower ranges, are actually not that dramatic when you put it in the context of your diet. And after considering all of this, although the findings of the article by Consumer Reports were somewhat useful, they do start to look a bit more like fear-mongering, and as if they tried to make a viral story out of this, and not as much as an accurate representation of the risk that these supplements pose. Of course, no lead is better than some lead, and if you want to limit your consumption of lead, then you would have to take the vegan protein powders out of the picture. But I think it was indeed pretty exaggerated, especially considering how much lead is there in everything that we're consuming. I hope that now you're not as worried as you used to be about this whole situation. I was certainly very confused with all of the values, and I did a lot of math for this video. I hope that I did it correctly, and if I did something wrong, I would not be mad at you if you pointed it out, to be honest. Thank you very much for being here with me today. I hope that you enjoyed the content of the video. Let me know down in the comments below if you did. Do not forget to like and subscribe so you do not miss anything new from me. Also, feel free to check out my website. This is linked in the description box below, and it contains some additional resources and also my nutrition counseling services. Thank you again very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.